Hey, good morning. I wanted to do a quick video for Scott Adams. He has asked this question a couple times about inflation and printing money and how can we print, trillions of dollars and, not have inflation. And is it just this one circumstance or kind of what's going on? I want to talk about three very simple subjects. I know Scott Adams knows about these. I know he's very well acquainted, but I want to put a little twist on them, and hopefully that kind of, you know, illuminates the situation. Hopefully I can add some value to this process. So the first is just supply and demand. Essentially you have a supply and demand of money. So if you think everything is denominated in US dollars, but the price of a dollar can go up or down, like the amount of the stock market your dollar can buy can go up or down depending on prices. And same thing with bread. If everything is moving relative to dollars, you can actually see that a dollar gets more expensive or less expensive. So what happened in this crisis is that demand for US dollars sank through the floor. So essentially, domestically at least, with people living inside the United States, people are no longer commuting to work. So they don't need dollars to buy gas. They're not buying houses, so they're not spending their money there. They're not buying new cars. They're not going out to eat as much. All these things, and then you can even look at this at the corporate level too. So if you're a business and you fire a bunch of people and you close down for a couple months, you're not paying payroll, you're not doing employee 401k matching, stuff like that. So demand for dollars sank through the floor. Now, supply of dollars is the number of dollars currently in our economy. So if you're thinking how many dollars currently exist in the United States, and how many can the Fed print, when demand collapses, when demand goes to the floor, and the price of everything should go down. So if you have your supply and demand curves, you shift your demand curve over here. So the price of everything, bread, houses, cars, should all go down. And normally this is done by discounting. So if you need to sell your house next week, but no one's coming in for your open house because of COVID-19, what you can do is actually lower the price of your house by 20% in order to get a buyer. But again, that's deflation. If everyone's reducing prices to entice people to come out and spend their money, that's nationwide deflation. To counteract this deflation and keep prices where they're at, what the Federal Reserve did, and this is actually true of the stock market too. When the stock market falls, when everything's falling, what's happening is people are putting their stocks on sale in order to entice buyers to come in because they need the money. They need the US dollars. So what happened is the Federal Reserve vastly increased the supply. So the supply increased, demand decreased, and what you got was essentially prices stayed the same. So prices, of bread, of meat, while there were some shortages, while some things did go up, it wasn't, a vast difference. The price of toilet paper didn't shoot up 500% or anything. It's generally stable, and, same thing with the stock market. Stock market decreased a little bit, generally stable though. It wasn't too big of a drop. It wasn't, it didn't sustain like a 70% drop or anything. It came right back to, it's about 10% of where it was before the COVID-19 situation happened. So that's one thing to keep in mind. For the short term, the reason why you're not seeing hyperinflation right now is because the Federal Reserve is essentially counteracting all the lost demand to keep prices stable, which is in their charter. Their charter is price stability. That's one of the main things, price stability and full employment. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The backside of that, the second concept, is what happens when all those people go back to work. So once demand starts increasing for goods and services again, once people start spending those US dollars, now that there's a lot more US dollars in in the United States, what happens at that point? And that's where people should be worried. It's not while we're in the lockdowns and as we're coming out. It's what happens when our economy starts going again, starts hitting its stride. You might see massive hyperinflation, especially in certain goods and services. So for example, stock market. Demand for stocks really decreased throughout this COVID-19 thing. A lot of employers pay, a lot of employees will put money in their 401k, which will go to buy stocks. A lot of employers will match that. So if you have millions of people, who put a pause on, all of this money entering the stock market, stock prices should fall because you don't have those buyers, that steady demand of buyers who are guaranteeing a minimum price floor. The Federal Reserve, there's other things that made, stocks decrease, but, lack of demand was one of them. But as the Federal Reserve goes and prints more money, and buys bonds and forces money into the equity markets, that brings stocks right to where they are. If it does happen, where people, let's say, go back to work and start putting money back in, the stock market as they normally do, if that does occur, there's a chance that, the stock market could go up really fast, because you have all that money that the Federal Reserve put in, plus all of that new demand that's coming back from employers and from, normal citizens buying stocks, retail buyers. So you've got to be careful for that. And so the Fed will probably have to increase interest rates, and do, certain things in order to stabilize that. And that's why it's such a difficult job for the Fed. Sorry, it's a hot day. So that's something to keep in mind. Another thing is, I'm going to try and keep this under, just a couple minutes. I'm going to wrap up. Another thing to keep in mind is that maybe we are seeing inflation. That a common metric of the stock market is earnings, the price per earnings. How much are you willing to pay for a company per each dollar of its earnings? If you're willing to pay more for like an Amazon or an Apple, it's because you think that in the future they're going to earn more than today. But, assuming, all else equal, you should be paying a certain number of dollars per earnings that company is making, per dollar of earnings. The price per earnings really went through the roof, because earnings went down for these quarters, and the prices kind of stayed the same. Prices are down a little bit from the highs, but not that much. But a lot of these earnings reports are just brutal. They went through the floor. So the problem is that one of these very common metrics that the stock market is evaluated on has just gone through the sky, right? Has really gone sky high. And even Amazon, like, they're making a ton more revenue, but they have a lot of costs, and they're not doing as well as they thought they would. They have a lot of costs that, and overtime pay, they're paying more people, they're bringing more people on. There's all kinds of costs that they have to pay for this COVID-19 thing, even if they're bringing in more revenue. So you just got to keep in mind that, when you look at certain metrics of the stock market, we are seeing massive inflation, and the inflation might get, even worse depending on, what supply and demand does coming out of this pandemic. So just keep that in mind. We might literally be seeing inflation. Inflation doesn't work everywhere all at once. It works in certain goods and services first, which is why the Federal Reserve usually targets treasuries. Because they want to confine all the inflation to financial assets rather than the government tries to protect Main Street from inflation. So that's what you're seeing right now. The danger is what happens when demand returns, and what happens if that inflation finds its way into Main Street. Then we really do have a problem. If bread goes to $5 a loaf, you might see riots in the street. Anyways, the last thing is that to keep in mind is the reason why it's so hard. Scott Adams said, why aren't any experts coming on and talking about this? It's very difficult to predict, because a lot of the supply and demand, I was talking all locally. I mentioned earlier, everything I've talked about so far is local. There's also a huge international market for US dollars. So for example, if Scott Adams is going to invest in Turkey, he's not going to want to he's not going to want that contract denominated in Turkish lira. He can't use Turkish lira, he can't do this, he can't do that. So most likely he will make a contract with a company or with a government, in Turkey, a local government, or maybe, their national government. But it's going to be denominated in US. Everything will be in US dollars. So he's going to give them a certain number of US dollars and expect a certain number of US dollars back. And that's usually how a lot of people do business in foreign countries. So the problem is unlike the United States, Turkey can't print US dollars. And a lot of these developing nations can't print, India, China can't print US dollars. Saudi Arabia, for example. So what happened is when all of this stuff goes haywire and governments and, foreign corporations need to move assets around, all of a sudden they have this huge, huge demand for US dollars. So domestically, demand goes down, and internationally, demand goes through the roof. This happened also in 2008. So what the Federal Reserve is trying to do is print a bunch of money to consume domestically, give it to citizens and corporations, bailouts, that kind of stuff domestically, in the short term, and then over time have that money leak into, soften the international dollar shortage. So it won't necessarily be that the Fed is absorbing those US dollars. It's that international organizations or international entities are going to be absorbing those US dollars. So, you have pour a bunch of money into the United States to keep prices stable. And as the United States is improving, those dollars will find themselves in international hands, which would be, fantastic, because that would protect your average American from, inflation. And so the only reason we really can print all these trillions of dollars is because there is, an international backstop. Essentially, the whole world is betting on the USD. Now, if China or Russia or, Saudi Arabia decides to drop the US dollar as their, reserve currency or whatever, that's when you would have an issue. And how much money? Because essentially, the international community is willing to accept inflation, because what's going to happen is that all that inflation is going to be moved into international economies, and these governments are willing to accept that extra inflation of our money printing, simply because the U.S. dollar is the most stable thing out there. So, hey, it's better than the alternative, which would be, denominating everything in, Chinese yuan or euros or something like that, or pesos. US dollar is by far the best currency to do it in for now. So the question is how much deflation will they tolerate, will the international community tolerate, before they decide to move to something else, whether that be gold, whether that be international, an international currency of some kind. Anyways, so long story short, I know this has been a bunch. I tried to speed through it, but supply and demand of dollars. There's domestic markets, which they try to make stability, in international markets. They're going to try and move that inflation to international markets, because the demand for dollars has just gone through the roof. Because this collapse has really hit other nations very, very hard compared to the United States.